From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, hello everyone. I am Betsy Peterson, the director of the American Folklife Center, and on behalf of the center and the library, I want to welcome you all today to the latest presentation in the Botkin series. The Botkin series is a wonderful opportunity for the American Folklife Center to present the latest scholarship from leading scholars in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage studies. And it's also an opportunity for us to enhance our own collections. And in fact, the Botkin series forms an important component of our acquisition strategies. Each lecture is videotaped and will become a part of our permanent collections, but will also eventually be webcast. So just a word to the wise, if you have your cell phone on right now, please turn it off, or else it will appear many years from now. Today, I have the honor of introducing the New York City-based folklorist Elena Martinez, who is a staff member with both City Lore in Manhattan and the Bronx Music Heritage Center. Ms. Martinez has received an MA in anthropology and an MA in folklore from the University of Oregon, and has been a folklorist at City Lore since 1997. In addition to more than a full-time schedule as an arts administrator, programmer, field worker, and the like, she's also co-produced the 2006 video documentary From Mambo to Hip Hop, A South Bronx Tale, which aired on PBS and won the National Council of La Raza's 2007 Alma Award for Best TV Documentary, and I just want to add my voice to the chorus. It's an excellent documentary. She's also curated the traveling exhibition Que Bonita Bandera, the Puerto Rican flag as folk art, and served as the assistant curator for the landmark 2011 exhibit Nueva York, 1613 to 1945, at Manhattan's El Museo del Barrio. Her presentation today, I'd Still Be Puerto Rican, Even If Born on the Moon, documenting Puerto Rican migration and community through the arts, traces the story of the Puerto Rican diaspora to the mainland U.S. during the 20th century and into the 21st through the lens of expressive culture. The history of Puerto Ricans and their contributions to American culture, and especially to the culture of New York and the metropolitan region of New York, is certainly widely recognized, but has often not been as well documented as it should be. People like Elena and other folklorists and documentarians are doing their best to correct that situation and highlight the work of folk and traditional artists as well as contemporary artists in New York by Puerto Ricans, by Nuyoricans, and is helping to sort of correct that picture. And so today I want to welcome Elena Martinez to this place, and I'm looking forward to the lecture, so please welcome Elena Martinez.
Hi everyone. I want to thank Betsy and Nancy for bringing me here, and I'm a little nervous. I'm at the Library of Congress giving a lecture, so if I probably talk really fast or something, just tell me to slow down if I start getting too fast. But I have a lot of things, I have a lot of photos and stuff to show you. And unfortunately, I had music there too, but the music files aren't working. But maybe at the end, I'll talk about some of the music things, and we can maybe go back to them and have some samples so you can listen to a little bit of that. But I just want to start off with just a basic introduction. This presentation is based on most of the images. I took out a few from an exhibit I was working on, added a few for this presentation. But today's presentation is based on an exhibit that was at the Clemente Soto Vélez Cultural Center in the Lower East Side of Manhattan last summer. And it was a collaboration with them, and we put this exhibit on. And it was supposed to be the history of the diaspora, the Puerto Rican diaspora to New York City in the 20th century. But we're using, as Betsy said, through expressive culture, through the arts, because the migration experience has been documented in many ways, from economic standpoints, from historical standpoints by many different scholars. But as a folklorist, we wanted to show the community and how the traditions that it uses and the music, and maybe how these have been influenced by the times or the people in their era. So hopefully that'll come through. So it is looking at the expressive arts. One of the other things that I did, again, I had to take some things out from the exhibit, but I did want to put an emphasis on women in the migration, because as some of you might be familiar with them, we hear the stories of the Puerto Ricans like Jesus Colon and Bernardo Vega, and we should. They have very important stories to tell, but there's a lot of other stories about women who were political leaders and social activists that we don't hear as often. So I wanted to try to get their story in to make them representative. So I try to have more women representing sort of the different aspects of the leadership positions in arts and culture as well. And one last sort of theme that comes up, I think, for me, as I went through this, that how expressive culture is used, is that it's become very almost institutional based. Like, people used to celebrate certain things in their home and do things in their home, but now the community, a lot of things that people use in the community are done through like institutional sponsorship. There might be El Museo or the Clemente Soto Vélez or different places like that sponsor holiday celebrations or different things, and that seems a lot of ways that culture seems to be practiced, not entirely, but it seems to be a way that it does happen a lot. So that's sort of like another thread that goes through there that has occurred through the years. So we'll be talking a little bit about all those things. Oh, and the title, just since we're talking about expressive culture, comes from a poem, Boricua en la Luna, by Juan Antonio Correter, who was a very political poet, very radical poet. He was in jail with Pedro Albizu Campos in the 40s and came to New York and had a very political paper, which I'll show at some point there. But his poem, it's a very famous poem. I guess if you guys got these brochures that were part of the exhibit, the whole poem's in there, and you can get the whole poem of where that line comes from. So I just wanted to start off the migration itself. You see the first shot is from Puerto Rico and then into the docks in Brooklyn. And again, I try to sprinkle some poetry. A lot of the poems you'll be seeing are from Nuyorican poets. The term Nuyorican, a lot of you might have heard that, and some might have heard it, not be familiar with it. Nuyorican is a term that originally meant someone of Puerto Rican descent who was born or raised in New York City. That's kind of grown. I'm sure, I don't know if, it's sort of like how the South Bronx has become sort of a term that means a lot. It's past its geographical bounds. Nuyorican is also sort of like a state of mind as well. It's something, you're not from the island, you're Nuyorican. I don't know if Chicago Puerto Ricans have a name for themselves, but Nuyorican is a term. There's like a school of poetry, the Nuyorican poetry, and from the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. And it's also spelled a little bit differently too. Originally, it should be spelled New, N-E-W, Yorican, but because of Miguel Algarín, the poet you see here, who we have his poem that talks a little bit about the effects of migration and leaving the island and the trauma of leaving your home. Miguel Algarín and Miguel Piñero came up with New Yorican, N-U, sort of just to kind of put it in people's face that we're doing something different. We're here. We have this own other culture and things that we're doing. So, and one of the things too is I'd like to point out, a lot of people might not know, is that the steamships when Puerto Ricans migrated after the Spanish-American-Cuban War, New York had been a very Cuban, actually, in the 19th century. Cubans were the largest Latino population, and then after the war, and then in the 20th century, the Puerto Rican community really grew. And the New York and Puerto Rico line had been in operation, and that's why a lot of Puerto Ricans ended up coming to New York City, because there were these shipping lines, cargo lines, that had these docks, the piers in Brooklyn that people came to. And so Puerto Ricans came to New York and settled in Brooklyn, and that's actually the common a lot of Latinos. There was a big Spaniard community, a big Basque community, a big Cuban community in Brooklyn Heights. You get off the piers there and you settle there, and it was very common. I know, like, my grandparents settled in Brooklyn for a little while, then moved up to East Harlem. Then when that got too crowded, you move up to the Bronx. So it seems like that's sort of like the pattern, not just the migration from the island, but the migration to the city as well. And up until 1928, the ships went to the piers in Brooklyn, and then they switched over to the South Street Seaport. The steamship travel is very iconic in the lives of many Puerto Ricans who came over here. Many of the people who probably came over by steamship, probably that generation, there's not many left from the people who came by steamship, because the steamship stopped in the 1940s. But again, I wanted to show, where there's iconic moments and landmark moments in people's lives that people make song and poetry and art about it. And again, maybe later I'll get a chance to play this But one of the steamships in during World War I, the Carolina, a lot of these ships were named after cities in Puerto Rico, and the Carolina is in the island. And the Carolina was torpedoed by Germans in World War One. And there's a plena. Plena is a traditional Puerto Rican genre, and there was this plena created, plena española. Cortijo was a very famous Afro-Puerto Rican musician, percussionist, 1950s, and he made this really famous, this song. But it's about the ship being sunk, and six ships were sunk that day by the Germans. This was the only one with passengers, and they lost a lot of passengers. So this is a newspaper from Puerto Rico Ilustrado on the island, and telling about what happened there. So it's remembered in song. This tragic incident is remembered in song. And also just want to show you another boat, the Coamo, which actually many people came over on the Coamo. That was like a boat that brought over a lot of people, again, named after an island. But something else that sort of comes about in culture is that when people think about, most people probably have heard of the ship called the Marine Tiger. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Puerto Rican or heard of that. The Marine Tiger is a ship that many people talk about. Oh, and they actually that they came over on, or there's actually a term, you were called a Marine Tiger. If you were called a Marine Tiger, that means you just got off the boat. You were real sort of like from the country, not really used to be in New York. You were a Marine Tiger, and there was another song about that too, but that is sort of like cannot be found. No one can find that. It was recorded by a Panchito Risset, a Cuban singer, and I've never have to see if any collectors have that. But there was a song about that too. The interesting thing though is the Marine Tiger only operated in 1945 for like a year until during World War II, and then it stopped. And then right after World War II, plane migration starts. The steamship era is over, and now Puerto Ricans are the first airborne migration to the mainland in the United States. One other thing I just wanted to point out, a lot of people might not know about, because Puerto Ricans are not immigrants, they're migrants. Because of the Jones Act in 1917, citizenship was granted. And so that makes they go through the immigrant experience and a lot of things that happen, it occurs to them, but they have different rights about how their government benefits and things like that. So, but one thing is these cards, which not a lot of people know about. These cards were worker cards that between 1925 and 1930 and 1959, over 47,000 of these cards were handed out to Puerto Ricans. They would help to get work, so you could prove you were a citizen. Even if you might have had an accent, might have not spoken English very well, but you could prove that you were a citizen and you could get a job. So not everyone had to get these, but if you wanted, you could get them. So many people did. And because the guy's signature in the bureau office, the migration office was Saldana, everyone just called them Saldanas, these cards. You have a Saldana. And actually at times they said they might have been sold. People would sell them to maybe other Peruvians or anyone else who needed a card. That would happen. So that was something that went on. But the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, if you want to look up, you can look up to see if maybe your family member, had a card or something. They have all the paperwork and stuff of all these cards there at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. So again, as I said, after World War II in 1949, planes, the faster travel, it's cheaper, people come by plane. And Luis Rafael Sanchez wrote this article, the Airbus, La Guagua Aria, about the back and forth taking a plane. So again, the experience of what people experience gets put into, gets written about, gets expressed in different ways. And then also a movie was later made out of it. And then at that Nueva York exhibit a couple years ago, Antonio Martorell, who's an amazing installation artist, did the installation named after that in the exhibit to talk about the back and forth, how migration plays such a pivotal, transformative experience for the community because it's so part of the story. No matter where what time you came over, if it was by plane, by steamship, this really, weighs heavily on your story and your experience here, and is very, how you see yourself here, in New York City, in the United States. So again, different. It's not really folk art, but there's ways that people have, taken the experience and transformed it into something artistic. One of the stories which I really think is really important that doesn't get talked about enough in a way that culture and music has been influenced by politics. And I wish, again, we won't be able to play the songs, we'll get to that later, but is the story of Rafael Hernandez and his brother Jesus Hernandez. And I think this just goes to show how music and culture, like I said, are influenced and are entwined deeply with political situations. In 1917, Puerto Ricans are granted citizenship, so there's, they have citizenship now. And a couple months after that, the World War I, United States has entry into World War I. Not saying there's been a lot of debate. There's not making any connection that one happened because of the other, that citizenship was granted, but because of that, there was a regimental band in Harlem. The 369th Regimental Band was based in Harlem, the 369th Regiment. And it was a segregated army. They were going over to France to fight the Germans, and the leader of the band was Captain James Reese Europe, who actually has a large collection here at Library of Congress, some of his stuff and some of the people who were in his band. And James Reese Europe needed more band members, but it was a black band, it was a segregated army, and he needed more band members, and they had to read a lot of music. He needed woodwinds especially. So someone's like, well, you can go over to Puerto Rico. They have a lot of very well trained musicians there who read music, and you can enlist them now because they are citizens now. So he goes to Puerto Rico and he enlists 18 Afro-Puerto Ricans into the 369th, which at the time was the 15th National Guard Regiment, and they come back and. Rafael Hernandez, who many of you might know, is considered the greatest composer in Latin America right now. Puerto Rico's greatest composer, and also in Latin America. But he gets his way over to the United States because he's part of the band. And Puerto Rico has and all over Latin America and in Puerto Rico, there's a huge tradition of the bandas municipales, the municipal bands that are very well trained. And this was an occupation that a lot of Afro-Puerto Ricans were allowed to do. So that's why they have these incredibly well trained musicians there who could read. They come over, they're part of the band. That band goes to Europe, and that regiment goes to Europe. And unfortunately, the General Pershing wouldn't allow them to fight with the American uniform. They had to fight with a French uniform. It's a really sad story, but they were very well decorated against the Germans, and their band would go around playing for a lot of French villages when they had time off. And this was the band that brought jazz to Europe, early proto-jazz and ragtime. And they introduced it to French audiences, and they loved it. So that's how jazz leaves its home of the United States and gets over to Europe. And Rafael Hernandez and his brother are in this band, but no one really knows this. Like if you watch Ken Burns' documentary on jazz, not even mentioned. They talk about the 369th because they're a very important band. Not even mentioned that 1/3 of the band was Afro-Puerto Rican. So, so they come back and Rafael, some of them go back to Puerto Rico, but Rafael stays and obviously settles in New York. He goes back and forth to Mexico, Cuba, and jobs and stays in New York, but then goes on to have this long, a career. And then I'll probably mention him later a little bit about some other stuff. But because of such a political situation where we had citizenship, James Reese Europe was able to go to Puerto Rico and get these artists and bring them back there and bring them back here. And they were and there's a few. Memphis Archives has some of recordings, and they think there's no roster of the artists that are on it, but many think that Rafael is on these early recordings from the Memphis Archives, that you can hear him playing trombone on there. So so he was part of that story. So now going into the experience of work, Puerto Ricans come here, they start businesses, they're getting jobs, and in the early, I'm just going to talk about a few different businesses that are really sort of iconic businesses. The cigar tobacco rolling industry was big in the late 1800s in New York City, and actually originally it was like Germans and Bohemians later on, but then of course the Cubans came during the 10 Years' War. A lot of Afro-Cubans came, settled, and then Puerto Ricans became part of that as well. So by the early decades of the 20th century, there were still cigar rolling factories, and Puerto Ricans were very much a part of that in New York City. And in this photo, you can see the gentleman up on the little raised platform was called a lector, and they were readers. And what they did, they would read, the tobacco rollers would pay a little bit of money so they could hire this person to read. And what they would do, in the morning, they would usually read the current newspapers, what was going on, all the current newspapers. And in the afternoon, they would read political and scientific works of Charles Darwin, Tolstoy, Victor Hugo, all these novels, and also these, other philosophical and political books as well. So cigar rollers, tobacco workers tended to be the most progressive, highly educated workers at the time in the Cuban and Puerto Rican community as well, all the different communities, because they had this lector who was part of the atmosphere of the factory. And someone I want to point out again, who's not always well known about that, is Luisa Capetillo. She's on the right. Luisa Capetillo was from Puerto Rico, from Arecibo, and she started out in the garment industry and later started working in the cigar factories in Puerto Rico. And then she became a lecturer in the cigar workshops in Puerto Rico. She moved to New York in 1919, and worked as a lecturer, wrote for Spanish language papers, and worked as a lecturer. And she was just very political, spoke at rallies. She had a great voice, and it was not very common. Women were not known to be readers, and actually, women. You see on the bottom and the right, that's not a Puerto Rican cigar factory, but it just shows women were given like the very low jobs in the tobacco factories. Just sort of, they were given the jobs to separate the strip away the leaf from the nib. So they didn't even get the good jobs in that. And then she was able to be a reader on top of it. So she was just had a lot of influence. But she did go back to Puerto Rico and got arrested for wearing pants. She was the first woman to wear pants on the island, as you see there. So she was just really ahead of her time for a lot of things. Bernardo Vega talks about her in his memoirs. As I mentioned, he was he's usually someone we think about, Bernardo Vega, when we think about the cigar industry, his memoirs. But and he talks about a little bit about her and her boarding house. He was also a very good cook in her boarding house in Lower Manhattan. But we usually think about him and his work in the cigar factories, and not that there were women, and then someone like Luisa Capetillo there as well. Another industry that's very important for the Puerto Rican community is, of course, the needlework trades. So, many of the needlework trades had traditionally been held by other communities, Jewish and Italian women. But by the 20s and 30s, a lot more Puerto Rican women Puerto Rican communities growing, and they take over and are starting to replace a lot of the workers, and particularly in dressmaking, accessories, and children's clothing. So, and then by the 1940s, they had become a major new source of labor in the undergarments trade and constituted half of the skirt industry's trade. So they were a major part of the garment industry in New York City. And there's a lot of oral histories. I mean, this is another thing that's a very part of the community, the experience. I'm sure everyone has like a grandmother, an aunt, or someone who might have worked in the garment industry doing something. It's just very much part of the experience, this migrant experience in New York City. And so many people have stories about this. But there is a history of that in Puerto Rico. There was a lot of piecework done. Girls did learn to do embroidery and different types of textile work. You see, right here, there's a picture of women in Puerto Rico. I think that's Aguadilla, that they're making lace, bobbin lace. It's the Puerto Rican lace, and which is really interesting because usually lace was considered I had always read that lace was considered the very elite upper class people did it, but obviously this is Afro Puerto Rican women making some lace. So obviously it was more spread out around the island than most people had thought. And I want a picture here of this was Rosalena Hipsiaco, was someone who was in New York City. She moved back to Puerto Rico a couple of years ago. She's a National Heritage Award winner from the NEA and for her bobbin lace. And she taught many, many women in New York City to do that. And it's not a tradition that a lot of people do because it's a very time consuming. A lot of the traditional Puerto Rican folk arts unfortunately don't get practiced as much as they should. That would be nice in New York City because things like mundillo, things like the vejigante mask are very time consuming. The Santos carving, which I'll show a little bit later too, are very time consuming. It's not like something you can just pick up in a couple classes. So it takes a lot of effort and supplies and resources as well. But she was someone who had always taught a bunch of classes and sort of like the heir to the legacy of Puerto Rican women working in textiles in New York City. Another industry, of course, is the markets, the bodega owners. And so that was very important because you have this growing Puerto Rican community in places like East Harlem. Between the world wars, East Harlem's growing. It's huge. You have all these Puerto Ricans moving in. But where do they get the food to eat? Their traditional food that's not there. All the pushcart vendors were Jewish. A lot of Jewish vendors did not supply this food. So bodega owners were starting to open to supply the food, to get the plátanos and the other foods that were needed to make the cuisine. What's really important is that on the upper picture, the black and white, is La Marqueta, which is one of those other important iconic places in New York's history, which most people, again, probably have stories of. In the late 1930s, from WPA funds, Mayor LaGuardia created a bunch of markets. There's the Arthur Avenue Market, the Essex Street Market, and this one was the Park Avenue Market. But no one called, in East Harlem, you didn't call it the Park Avenue Market, you called it La Marqueta. And that's where everyone went. And not only just buy food, you would buy your shoes there, you'd buy clothes there, you'd go with your mom on Sunday, you'd make the trip from the Bronx maybe and go down there. So everyone went there. And it was, as you can see, it was a really really vibrant place. There's tons of vendors, a lot of things going on. It's still open, but it's like a shadow of its former self. There's a few vendors, and they're trying to make a comeback, but it's been very hard. But they still have it going. They have live music outside of it on Saturdays. If you ever get a chance to go there, there's like live salsa, that people go to. That actually gets more people than probably go into the actual marqueta. But it's very, even though, like I said, it's not vibrant and strong like it once was, it's still a very big part of the memory for many people who lived in East Harlem and the Bronx and New York City and other places, other enclaves in New York City as well. Just some other bodegas. Oh, I just want to show this ID card too of the Ulpiano Onanue. That's the family name for the people who started Goya. I just thought I'd add that in there because you can't think of Latino food without the Goya family. So this is one of the worker ID cards. The people who started the Goya family, the Unanues, were from the Basque Country actually, but they came through Puerto Rico, and then from Puerto Rico migrated up to New York City and founded the Goya in around the 20s or so. And I think they had like a factory on Duane Street in Manhattan. So that's where they were. And of course, Goya, oh boy, everyone's like grew up with all those things. If it's Goya, it's got to be good. We all know that. So that's part of the living in New York and probably now nationally and eating Latino food. Another entrepreneur business were the botanicas. The botanicas were important for people who practice espiritismo or santeria. And santeria became bigger among the community after like a large amount of, in the 1960s and 70s, when you had a large immigration of Cubans again to the tri-state area, a lot of Puerto Ricans also started becoming santeros and practicing the Afro-Cuban religion of Santeria. So this was another business that was very important for the community. And the Justo one you see there is in East Harlem, and it's like one of the oldest, I think, in the city. It's been around for a very long time. And these are just some items from, if you're a worshiper, that you would practice with. That's the altar, La Mesa Blanca for espiritistas, and then on the side is the Madama dolls. This is made by Ramonita Zavala is the woman who made that with her son who helped her, and she was in the garment industry, and she does things like this. And this is her Madama doll that she made, and we used it in an exhibit for something else a few years ago. But Madama dolls actually come from people who practice espiritismo and santeria. They use them to sort of like they sometimes set them in little chairs to sort of like call down the spirits a little bit. But people nowadays, even if you're not a practitioner of that, they're sort of like, you want them, people like them, and they might just be gifts or anything. So you could have one even if you're not a practitioner. And a lot of people just make them just to sell, not have any religious significance to them. One last business that's very important. Well, we have two more. One last business that's very important is the music stores. Music stores were really, really important to the emerging Puerto Rican community because New York, what we know as New York music, what later became mambo and salsa and all these music, come out of New York, and the early music stores in East Harlem were very important to that because you come to New York, you're missing your homeland, you walk by these music stores, you hear the sounds emanating from the speakers of the music from your homeland. And also, if you were a musician, if you needed a gig, you'd go to the store owners, where's someone playing, what bands are playing. If you were a big record label owner like Decca or Victor, you went to them and say, what's hot right now, what's playing. And so some of these store managers became very important figures in the connection between the music scene and the music business. This is Rafael Hernandez again with his sister Victoria Hernandez. They were very close, and they started a store in East Harlem on Madison Avenue. You can see the Hernandez Music Store. They started that in 1927. And again, to see the garment industry connection, Rafael was very like bohemian. He would just hang out, smoke cigarettes, play his guitar on the sidewalk. He, wrote Lamento Borincano supposedly in that store. But she was the businesswoman. She was an expert business manager. And it was very amazing because at the time in the 1920s, only about 0.5% of the Puerto Rican population, Puerto Rican females were owning businesses. And here she was running a business, being this connection between business owners. And she did work in the garment industry before she went to the music business, and so half her store had dresses and half the store had music, so she would sell these. And then she always had that. And I think this idea of having a store that's just one thing, like Virgin or Tower, that's sort of a newer thing. Years ago, people had like a lot of different things selling in their store. What happened, he went to Mexico for a little while because the Mexican movie industry was huge. He went to work in movies there. She moved up to the Bronx, at some point. In 1941, opened another store. And she worked in a store, in this building on Prospect Avenue. And you can see underneath the Casa Amadeo sign is Antigua Casa Hernandez. That was her store. In 1969, Miguel Amadeo, the gentleman on the bottom, he bought the store from her. And he changed it to Casa Amadeo because he's a famous composer in his own right. And once he changed it to Casa Amadeo, she never went back in the store. She was really mad, he said. But and she ended up moving back to Puerto Rico. But she was an incredible figure. She was this woman who had a lot of power in the business. And again, but you don't hear of her. You don't hear of people on the sidelines like that a lot. She also was an accomplished musician herself. But women, it wasn't really proper for women to go into musicians is for bohemians and people who do drugs and things like that. It wasn't proper at that time for a lot of women to go into music, so she didn't. But she gave piano lessons in the back of the store. I mean, in the East Harlem store, she gave piano lessons to a young man named Tito Puente. So she was his teacher. And Casa Amadeo, City Lore, the work that we did, we've worked a lot from mambo to hip hop. The work that we did, we were able to, we nominated Casa Amadeo and it got put on the National Register of Historic Places in 2003. The building that it's housed in, that building is on the National Register because of Casa Amadeo being there, because of its work within the Puerto Rican community and Puerto Rican music. And it's the first place on the mainland, the first Puerto Rican site on the mainland that was nominated to the National Register. One last sort of business sort of thing is just periodicals and newspapers. Since the 1900s, the Cubans had tons of papers when they were here. Puerto Ricans followed suit and had many different papers. And the Gráfico was a really big one, owned by Bernardo Vega. Bernardo Vega actually ran it for some point. But what was really interesting about newspapers and the periodicals at that time, they might have, in the Spanish language world, they might have had things about politics. They always had poetry, though. They had poetry and cultural things. So it was really a mixed thing. There was never just this idea that all was just poetry, all was just business. There was columns about the latest things that was going on in the art world or the theaters, and a lot of poetry, too, as I mentioned. So this was just very important in the community as well. And Gráfico was a very important paper for a while. I wanted to bring this up because this is one of my favorite stories too, is that when we talk about publications, is that I don't know if any of you are comic book fans, but Marvel Comics for a while was run by a Cuban recently, Jose Quesada. But so everyone thinks, oh, this is the first Latino to have to do with comic books. Actually, the Latino connection with comic books goes back much further. Alex Schomburg, who's a distant relative of Arturo Schomburg, that the library is named after, he came over here in the 19-teens, and he was a graphic artist and printer, him and his brothers. And in 1939, he became part of right before World War II, we started writing for different science fiction magazines and got involved with Marvel. And that's one of his Marvel covers. He drew a lot of the Captain America, Submariner, Human Torch. If you're a Marvel fan, you might know some of these names. And he did a lot of covers for them. Stan Lee, one of the from Marvel, called him the Norman Rockwell of comics. So and so he was, he did a lot of work there. And you can see the World War II imagery, the superheroes fighting Nazis, Captain America and stuff. So this was the golden age of comics at the time. And next to it is just a current comic book from an artist in the Bronx, just so that it keeps going. And this current Miguel Angel Ruiz does his comic book, and his main character is based on the Vejigante mask. It's this figure who has a sort of Vejigante mask, which I'll get to later. That's a traditional Puerto Rican art, traditional mask. And so he uses that now, and he's making this series now, and it's just very self-published, but he's like kind of trying to get it over in New York City. So the Puerto Rican influence in comic books has been around. So as I mentioned before, I wanted to point out some of the women. There's these different parts of the Puerto Rican migration experience and what the diaspora, what people did when they came here, that women were very much a part of, and we don't always hear. So in Brooklyn especially, when people think of the Puerto Rican community, we always know the South Bronx. We know the South Bronx is a big enclave. We hear about East Harlem. The Lower East Side, which doesn't get as, is also very important and doesn't always get as credited with having a lot of artists from there as well, and political activists. But Brooklyn had a very large contingent of people who were very involved in the Democratic Party machine and the Socialist Party, and a lot of different things going on. And Celia Vise is really important. She was involved in many different civic business organizations, but she also, in part of her work, she started the Three Kings Parade in Brooklyn, which still goes on. I know there's the one in Williamsburg, I think that's the one. And she started that in the 1960s. So again, even though she's a businesswoman involved in other civic activities, this cultural thing is something from part of the culture, and she made that part of her work as well. Another thing that was very big from the in the Brooklyn community, there was a lot of different organizations, political clubs, social organizations, mutual aid societies, and Antonia Denise was this woman who was very involved in many different ones. She started actually the largest mutual benefit society in Brooklyn in the 1920s. So she was a very important person starting all these different aid clubs. When you're a new migrant to the city, you need all these different organizations to help you. And all immigrants have this. There's a lot of immigrants from all different communities have these different social hometown clubs or social clubs to help them. Like, I come here, I don't speak the language, I need help. Who do I go? Where do I get a job? Where do I go to find a place to live? So there's organizations like these. And in the Puerto Ricans, there were hometown clubs were the really big ones. There were like over 70 to correspond to the island, the number of municipalities on the island of hometown clubs. So this club Cabo Rojeño was a really famous one, and it just started out as a small hometown club. If you were from Cabo Rojo, that's where you would go to. Cabo Rojo is this little island, town on the western part of the island. You would probably go to that social club for events and things. Later on in the 50s, in the 60s, it becomes this hot spot for Latin music, for mambo music. So you're seeing a band there in 1956. So it became like a really important spot for some of these did change. Some of these did make it over, like cross over to sort of more, I don't want to say commercial, but more open more to the public. But a lot of the hometown clubs had a lot of different activities. Here's another one. There's Añasco Social Club has its float in the parade. And actually, the Puerto Rican parade started out by El Congreso de los Pueblos, of a group of all the hometown clubs. And that's what actually started the parade. It was all the hometown clubs coming together. So while they did mutual aid stuff, while they did civic work for the community to help the community, there also was a definitely cultural aspect of the work that they did as well. Just to touch briefly on politics, Oscar Garcia Rivera was the first Puerto Rican elected to a public office. He was an assemblyman from East Harlem in the 1930s. And the reason I wanted to bring him up is because the Lucky Corner was a really important spot in East Harlem. And it's sort of like one of these spaces that are sort of like people talk about. It's not that there's a sign there or anything, but all the politicians in East Harlem would go to the Lucky Corner and give their speeches and give their rallies. And you could see his name's on that one, for that rally. And also Fiorella LaGuardia and Vito Marcantonio, which at that time, we always hear stories. I don't know if anyone's read Carlito's Way or anything. There's all these stories about the Puerto Ricans and Italians always, butting heads in East Harlem. But actually, there was a time when the Italian community was actually very supportive of the Puerto Rican community. Marcantonio was a lawyer for Pedro Albizu Campos when he was in prison. And actually, I think, from what I heard, I don't know if this is true, but Mark Anthony's father named him after Vito Marcantonio. So he was very political. So the community worked together in politics, and Marcantonio and LaGuardia fought very hard for Puerto Rican rights and in New York City. And of course, I wanted to just bring in, of course, the most important political figure. There's a few people that are very iconic in the community. Tito Puente and Sonia Sotomayor is one of them too. It's become so iconic for the work that they do that they take what we as Nuyoricans are and take that to a national stage. And I wanted to include a part of a poem from Tato Laviera, one of the other Nuyorican poets. Tato Laviera is considered one of the most has the most books out, most published author of the Nuyorican poets, and he wrote recently a poem for in honor of Sonia Sotomayor. Sorry, there's a few typos in there, but he wrote that, and I think actually she was able to see this poem at some point. So again, these people are landmark events, and people in our community bring out poems or songs from people. Another really important activist who I think is so important, and again might not be not known outside of the community, is Evelina Antonetti. Evelina Antonetti, she came from Puerto Rico, and actually her mentor, when you see in the top picture, she's next to Jesus Colon. He was one of her mentors, and he really helped her get involved in politics. She got into labor organizing, but then settling in the Bronx, she became a really outspoken advocate for the community, and actually became known as the Hell Lady of the Bronx. She was actually called the Hell Lady of the Bronx because she didn't take anything from any local politician or anyone. And she founded United Bronx Parents in the 60s. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with United Bronx Parents, but they started out as they established bilingual, bicultural daycare center. But later on, as they realized that more services were needed for the community, they launched a lot of adult education programs, rehab programs, and actually became a model for social services all around in the Northeast. So she started that. Her daughter took over for many years, the organization. But what's really important, that's her in the bottom picture above the sign. But one thing I really think is really important about UBP is that they also use culture to talk. If you're doing social services, you cannot not use culture. This is in their main building in the Bronx on Prospect Avenue. That's bomba, the music of bomba from Puerto Rico. There's dancers there doing bomba dance. Whenever they would have events to get the people, to get the community involved and active, they would have, they would have events like that to get the people together. And actually, they just a couple weeks ago, I saw Lorraine, her daughter, and they named a street after Yomo Toro. I don't know if anyone knows who Yomo Toro, the cuatro player, Puerto Rican cuatro player. He passed away last year. They named a street after him. So she was there telling a story about when UBP, United Bronx Parents, did voting registration. They sat Yomo on 2 milk crates in front of the building with his cuatro and just had him play for hours and hours all day just to get people to come. So they realized the importance that how you need the arts and the culture, the arts and culture to bring people in to get them interested in what's going on. Another thing that United Bronx Parents was very active in was the rallies against the movie Fort Apache, the Bronx. A lot of you might probably remember that movie from around 1980 or so with Paul Newman. And there was the CAFA, Committee Against Fort Apache, was formed. And United Bronx Parents was very involved in that committee, and they would form rallies every day while they were shooting in the Bronx. I'm sure they just created just a hassle for the filmmaker and Paul Newman and everyone, but they would have all these rallies all the time, and at the top is the rally. But what they would do at the rallies, they always had music, and they always had performers to get people. The bottom is some of the musicians. There is, on the left is Mario Rivera, on the right is Andy Gonzalez, Nuyorican bass player, probably the most recorded bass player in Latin music right now. And Andy and his brother, Jerry Gonzalez, through being in this band, all these guys being in this band, they formed the Fort Apache band through there, and the Fort Apache band still plays, and they still perform today. And Jerry Gonzalez, when he formed that, he said the reason they called it the Fort Apache band, and this is from an interview. I don't know if this was his real reason, but this is what he said in an interview, is that he formed the band to show people that there is good things that come out of Fort Apache. Fort Apache was the name of a police precinct on Simpson Avenue Simpson Street in the Bronx. That the cops named it Fort Apache because they were surrounded by hostile territory, all the people who lived there. And the movie basically showed very bad depictions of Puerto Ricans and African Americans. So in this Committee Against Fort Apache, they wanted to show that, no, we're not, everyone in the neighborhood is not like that. And the Fort Apache band wanted to show that, there's good things, there's art, culture, and music that come from that as well. I just wanted to show, this is an old flyer from the Park Palace that also shows a lot of old musicians, Rafael Hernandez, Davidita, Rita Silva, and getting involved in political events as well. Again, music, politics were always sort of hand in hand. That's a mural right in front of the old building of Evelina. Evelina's yelling at some politician there. In the real photo there. And the photo, the other part of the photo comes from her grandson, Joe Conzo Jr., who's a very famous hip-hop photographer, and he documented a lot of the Bronx when it was burning. They put the Tats Crew, is a really famous graffiti arts collective, who actually came here to the Smithsonian, to the Folklife Festival about over a decade ago. And they painted this last year at United Bronx Parents in honor of her. I'm going to get more into the murals, how important murals and public art is to the community as well. And of course, when we talk about politics and community activism, of course, the Young Lords are really important. And the bottom is a Young Lords rally. The top of them, I wanted to show the women of the Young Lords because the men of the Young Lords get a lot of recognition. Felipe Luciano, Juan Gonzalez, all those guys. But Pablo Guzman, they write, they've been on news shows and stuff. But there was an active women, and they made sure that that the women's issues got really represented in the Young Lords issues as well. And the woman all the way on the left is Eloise Morales, and she's a filmmaker and a lawyer, and she made the film Palante Siempre Palante about the Young Lords. There's another, again, the 60s at this time. I mean, all this stuff was going on. United Bronx Parents, Young Lords. It's the 60s. It's identity. There's all these identity politics going on, right? The Young Lords are modeled after the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement, the feminist movement. So there's a lot of going on, and the students are also rising and at this time, Puerto Rican studies and African American studies people are trying to push them to get them, involved and get these departments in the school as well, these programs in the school. So all the stuff that was going on at that time is because there was a political climate of the time as well. And one other group I want to point out again, where where social activism and culture come together, is in Park 52 in the Bronx. I work in the Bronx, so a lot of my stuff is like a very Bronx based. And this park is across the street from the old PS 52, where Ray Barretto went to PS 52, Manuel Kendo went there, Eddie Palmieri went there, Joe Quijano, all these musicians went there. So the park across the street, in around 1980, the Parks Department was broke. right? A lot of New York City was broke. They're not taking care of it. There was crack vials, there was garbage. Community members, a bunch of community members got together, cleaned up the park, and they painted it a different color in the Parks Department. They refuse to paint it the Parks Department color because they do it on their own. And they take care of the park, and they make sure kids have access to the equipment there, the balls and everything that they need. But they also, about 25 years ago, started a concert series. They asked, and the Parks Department wanted to build more handball walls. And they're like, well, handball walls are really lazy thing to do, is just putting up a wall. We want you to build a theater. So they made the Parks Department build a little amphitheater. And now every summer for the past, actually probably closer to 30 years, they show, every Wednesday in the summer they have Latin jazz and Latin salsa concerts there. And they're going on right now, and they do that for the community. The community comes out, it's packed. But they show what you can do as community activists to help your community and bring music into that as well. And this is from a photo of City Lore. It's part of our from Mambo to Hip Hop film. We had all the alumni from the school come together and play in a concert. So again, now I just want to get into some of the actual arts that produced by the community. And when we think of poetry in the community, everyone usually knows that Julia Burgos is like one of the most famous poets in the Puerto Rican community. But I was very interested in this woman. Her real name, she goes by Clara Layer, but her name was Mercedes Negron Munoz, and she was the cousin of Luis Munoz Marin, the first elected governor of Puerto Rican governor of the island. And she lived in New York for a while in the 1920s, and she wrote some poetry about New York. So I thought it was really nice that she actually came to New York and sort of wrote and lived in New York and wrote about New York. And actually she was actually an inspiration for Julia Burgos, who came later. And of course, there's Julia, and she came to New York in 1942. She'd already been a published poet, but she got really involved in politics. Juan Antonio Correger, the poet who did the name of the presentation, he had a paper called Pueblos Hispanos. It was very political. I think it might have been partly funded by the Communist Party or something, which is an incredibly progressive political paper. And she had a column in there, and she put poetry in there. There's sort of not a very good copy of it, but you can see that that was the paper, Pueblos Hispanos, and she worked on that as well. She was very involved in the independentista movement, the nationalist movement of the island at that time. And right to the right is a mosaic by Manny Vega. Manny Vega is a really prolific artist in New York City right now. He does a lot of public art, outside art. He does all kinds of artwork, but his art is seen everywhere in the Bronx and East Harlem. And he does a lot with mosaics. You see him in different subways, and this one he did a few years ago, actually in 2006. It's called Remembering Julia, and it's on 106th Street, because she actually, unfortunately, in her life, she was very ill, and I think she had alcohol problems as well, and she was found on a street unconscious and taken to the hospital, and no one knew who she was, and she was buried in a potter's field until her family finally came and claimed her, and she's now buried in Puerto Rico. But so because she has that connection to East Harlem, that they put that to remember her by. Sorry, this isn't a very good photo. This is, I wanted to get someone, when we talk about poetry in the Nuyorican, I'm going to talk about the Nuyorican poetry, the Nuyorican movement, whatever we want to call that. This gentleman, is someone who's very inspirational to all of us poets, but you'll never hear about him. Jorge Brandon was from Puerto Rico, from Moca, from the town of Moca. But he was called El Coco que Habla. That was his name for himself. And he was sort of like a guy who lived on the streets, but was a declamador, sort of. Just like, it was on the streets. What you see there, the Lower East Side had sort of very similar experience as the Bronx. When people think of the Bronx, buildings burnt down, empty lots like that, had a very similar experience, and he would just be part of this neighborhood. I don't know if you ever had heard of him, Connie, but he was part of this, part of the street culture there, and many of the young poets like Tato La Viera, Miguel Algarin, who were young poets at the time, would see him, and sort of he was like an inspiration for them. And, you could see him walking along the street. Sometimes he'd do his poetry in decimas, the decima tradition of Puerto Rico. Not that the Nuyorican poets really used decima, but it sort of like gave them a link to sort of the poetry from the island. And also this idea of being a declamador. The declamador is a tradition from all over Latin America, but in Puerto Rico as well, where you declaim, you get up and you state things in like the public square sort of in poetic form. And so he was sort of like that. And then here is Miguel Algarin. We saw his poem before, and that's him in front of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. And that was, of course, the Nuyorican Poets Cafe is such an important site for the Puerto Rican community when it comes to poetry. Miguel started that in 1974 because all the poets used to meet in his living room. And he said he wanted to just get everyone out of his living room, so he started a club. So that's how the Nuyorican Poets Cafe was born. And it provided a forum for all these poets like Tato La Viera, like Santa Maria Esteves, who was part of that. Victor Hernandez Cruz, Miguel Pinheiro, Bimbo Rivas, and also you see there Pedro Pietre, the poet Pedro Pietre, who passed away a few years ago, who was very, very beloved poet of that scene as well. And you see that mural on the Nuyorican was created by Chico Garcia, who was a local graffiti artist, a local mural artist from the Lower East Side. Want to bring in, I mentioned Arturo Schomburg earlier, and when we think of Puerto Ricans and the library system, we think of Arturo Schomburg. But actually, Puerto Belpré here was actually the first Puerto Rican library in the NYPL, the New York Public Library System. And what she did, what was really important, what she did is that she a lot of people call her a folklorist, which I don't really think she should be called a folklorist. She's an author, and she wrote children's stories, and she was a storyteller, but she reinterpreted a lot of Puerto Rican folk tales that she heard growing up. And she would tell them to kids at these story times in the library. So she was there. So the librarians there realized what she could do and her resources. She helped them. She became an active advocate for Spanish-speaking books and presentations at the library. She instituted bilingual story hours, made sure there were Spanish language books at the library, implemented programs based on holidays like Three Kings. So we really brought Puerto Rican culture because she's coming at a time. Oh wait, Kevin, there's a lot of I don't have much time. A lot of Puerto Ricans coming. So, and that's her famous book, Perez and Martina, based on an old folktale. I want to just go through some of these really fast. I really want to get to the end part, which is a lot of like stuff that's going on now. Miriam Colon, the theater, Puerto Rican theater, really had was really important. There was different sorts. There was a dramatic theater, which Miriam Colon comes out of, but there was also these theaters like the Teatro Puerto Rico. You can see literally a line around the block. That's what it was like. These were sort of like vaudeville shows where you'd see a flamenco dancer, a Puerto Rican traditional singer, maybe a hula hoop person too. Who's the blind guitarist? Jose Feliciano got his start at this theater, Teatro Puerto Rico, when he was 8 years old, in talent show there. So they would have all these sort of different shows like that. Then they have bands as well. And of course, Mexican movies. Every Puerto Rican went and saw Mexican movies because it was the golden age of Mexican cinema. That's why my father and every Puerto Rican I know older than that loves mariachi music. So that comes from like those shows. Lower East Side theater community, Bimbo Rivas, who I mentioned earlier, it's a mural of him. But he coined the phrase Lower East Side. He was the one who coined that in a poem he did, and Lower East Side is a name that the sort of the Puerto Rican community gives to the Lower East Side. It was from a poem. He said, "The mountains and the valleys cannot compare my love to you, Lower East Side. I love you." So, again, and that's what meant public art is so important to the Puerto Rican community. Nitza Tufino was one of the founding members of Talla Boricua. This is one of her pieces in the 103rd Street subway, and that's another Manny Vega mosaic in the 110th Street subway. But Talla Boricua, again, is one of these organizations that started in the 1960s with all these identity politics going on. A lot of African American and Puerto Rican artists got together and would protest things at like MoMA and stuff because they didn't show any ethnic artists. So to remedy that, they started Talla Boricua, the Puerto Rican workshop, so that they can do their own work. More public art, the cast, the very famous cast by Rigoberto Torres and John Ahern in the South Bronx. Rafael Ferrer's Puerto Rican Son, also in the Bronx. Tats Crew, I mentioned earlier, do memorial walls. Memorial walls are these very, were very big in the 80s during the crack epidemic when there was a lot of violence and problems. They're not really as popular as much anymore. Tats Crew did hundreds of them, but, families would want to remember their loved ones who maybe died in some gang violence or drug violence, and people would pay them to make these walls. That's the Graffiti Hall of Fame on 106th Street. Every year, it's changed. You can go and watch them. It's sort of like a big performance. Watch them make the new murals. This is a Tats Crew one with all the Puerto Rican symbols in it because most of Tats Crew is Puerto Rican. And one thing I wanted to mention too, the silk screening tradition in Puerto Rico was really big. It was really popular on the island. And at one point in the mid-century, the government used it to, if a lot of people were illiterate in the countryside, so they would make screen prints to get the word out about certain issues to them. And later on, in the 60s again, it became a political tool, and it was used for festivals as well to advertise for things. So Talla Boricua used silk screens a lot in their work in East Harlem. But this was a silk screen that was made for our exhibit, the exhibit that this is all based on by Miguel Reyes, who was based in the Clemente Soto Velas Center in Lower East Side. I don't want to talk too much about music because music is its own lecture, but La Música Jíbara, the music of the countryside in Puerto Rico, that's Ramito, who's very famous. Everyone has probably heard of Ramito, and Ramito made the song Que Bonita Bandera, which you hear all the time at the parade and everything, and he wrote that. And that's Yomo Toro on the bottom, who's a most very influential figure. He was a cuatro player, but he was also a very important guitar player before he became known for the cuatro, and that's him in a New York radio station. But Willie Colon, who's a very famous salsa singer, salsa trombone player and musician, Willie Colon was so influenced by Ramito's work. He's growing up Puerto Rican. Salsa musicians basically play Cuban music. Salsa is Cuban music, but Willie really reintroduced Puerto Rican elements into what we call salsa, and made it gave it some like Puerto Rican flair. And what he did is that there was a song by Ramito, a Decima song called Patria y Amor, and Willie took it, and Hector Lavoe, who's in that picture on the album cover with him, they named it Canto a Borinquen, Song to Puerto Rico, on this Christmas album. And this Christmas album, Asalto Navideño, is so important to to Puerto Ricans of the generation from the 70s on, because people in the 70s had never heard their own music. If you're a young Puerto Rican growing up in the 60s and 70s, you hear salsa, that's Cuban music. What's the music from the island? And this album took decimas and the aguinaldos from Christmas and put them to salsa arrangements. And then you have Willie and Hector on the cover, kind of an urban Bronx version of Christmas, right? Stealing the presents, I guess, or something. But the asalto is sort of a double meaning, too, because an asalto in Puerto Rico is the Christmas caroling. You do an asalto, you assault people with music, these parandas that you go on. And then they were just sort of using the play on the word asalto, sort of an assault, robbery or something. So bringing it sort of to the Nuyorican mindset. La Calandria is another La Música Jíbara, this old time music from Puerto Rico. She was a major proponent of that. And what's amazing is she was a trovador. Ramito was she's a trovadora. He was a trovador. Trovador is not just a singer; they improvise. They know the music so well they can improvise. She was also this amazing improviser, and she lived in the Bronx. She ended up spending the rest of her life from living in Puerto Rico and living in the Bronx, and that's her at the Teatro Puerto Rico. But usually women don't get like the recognition like when it comes to things like that, being improvisers and masters of the genre. The pava, the Puerto Rican pava from the Música Jíbara, is, even though it's used from that genre, the sort of the campesino, the jíbaro from the island, it's still used today. It's sort of people use it as an identifier, even though they wouldn't wear it maybe all the time. If people were at the parade, the Popular Party uses it for their symbol in Puerto Rico, and that's from the parade. So there's people who also are for the PPD and in New York City as well. And I wanted to bring just two popular musics. Popular music is, maybe outside the bounds of what we usually study as folklore. But again, Tito Puente is so iconic. He brought the Nuyorican community, brought the Nuyorican culture to the, and as a musician, as someone who is Nuyorican, brought that to the forefront, became international. And Mirta Silva I wanted to mention because she is someone who doesn't get recognition. She sang for the band Sonora Matancera, which she left, and when she left that band from Cuba, another young woman took over, and who wasn't as well liked because everyone loved Mirta. The woman who took over was Celia Cruz. So she was this amazing singer, Mirta Silva. She also could play timbales really well, and she sang guarachas, and guarachas is this type of Cuban music that are really raunchy and have like a lot of like double entendres and stuff, and she was really known for that. But people don't always, get to know her as well. She's not really known outside the mainstream. So, and she was just really important. She had her own TV show that everyone grew up listening to. So, she's always sort of a caricature too. She would like dress up funny sometimes, and she was a big lady, so people would make fun of her. But she was just a really great musician as well. The identity politics of the time, all the stuff that's going on, the music is also transformed by all what's going on too. And Latin Boogaloo of the time is really part of that, what's going on in the 60s. And and Latin Boogaloo is a mix of Cuban music and African-American R&B. And this band, Pete Rodriguez's band, Pete Rodriguez was from Simpson Street in the Bronx, right down the street from Fort Apache. I Like It Like That. You all probably know that song, right? You probably know it. Heard on the Burger King commercial. It was very famous there for a while. But that was like the biggest hit of that time. But there were many Puerto Rican musicians who were part of the Boogaloo movement, and that sort of like was the transition from the older mambo era into the salsa era of the 70s. And the Ghetto Brothers were a Puerto Rican band who the Ghetto Brothers were a gang, but they loved rock music. They loved Beatles and stuff, so their music was like influenced by rock. So I just want to show some of these transitional musics. Now, just to point out, again, one of the things I just want to mention really quick, I'll go through this really fast, that the idea that people do all kinds of things in their own home. They make the food, they celebrate holidays and stuff, but sometimes we don't have a chance to do that, or we don't know how to do that. Maybe you don't have the resources to. So now there's ways that people can celebrate a lot of stuff but there's institutional sort of sponsorship of these things. most Puerto Ricans love to trade coquito, love to go over friends or families for coquito around Christmas time. But actually, this woman, Debbie Quinones in East Harlem, she in 2001, she started the Coquito Masters. And it's a big contest. And it used to just be in one area, and like El Museo would have it. Now there's a borough by borough sub-contest, and then the winners all go to El Museo at the end, and there's, the winner. But coquito is very much a part of the Puerto Rican experience. I think everyone looks forward to that. For Christmas time, it's basically eggnog, right? Puerto Rican eggnog with rum. So pasteles, of course, another thing about Christmas time, you share your pasteles with everyone. But again, these are things that might have not always been Christmas time things, but they're so time intensive and so much labor goes into them. Usually you make them one time a year with a lot of family around, and that's it. Then you share them with everyone. And that's actually the same thing with La Música Jíbara, that music of Ramito and that, La Música Jíbara. It wasn't always just Christmas music, but people call it Christmas music now. It actually was just music the people in the rural and the countryside listened to. But when people came here, it sort of like this became something that people would listen to on holidays, and the shows, the big shows would happen around holiday time, where you'd get all these singers to come up and people would go. Santos carvers, Santos are another folk art from Puerto Rico. Again, not many people here do it because it's very time intensive, very labor intensive, and it's very skilled. But there is a woman now in the Bronx, the first woman I've met here who's doing it, in Marta Rodriguez, and that's her Three Kings. And then, of course, there's the Three Kings, another thing. Three Kings is something people celebrate. But Clemente Soto Velas in the Lower East Side, El Museo del Barrio in East Harlem have Three Kings events. So if you don't celebrate it in your home, you can go, and they always have the Papo Leto, the poet, or some Johnny Colon, I think one time was a Three King. Famous musicians or poets or people in the community will dress up as a Three Kings. And Yomoto used to play the cuatro, so you could celebrate the Three Kings, even if it might not be something you do in your home. The Stations of the Cross during the spring for Easter time was something celebrated in different communities. St. Bridget's Church would do it in the Lower East Side, and in Crotona, they would do it near Crotona in the Bronx. Fiesta de Cruz in May. Again, it's something that a lot of people in the island might have once celebrated, and it's based on the May ceremonies and to celebrate Mary. And it's a novena, a 9-day celebration. That's why you see this altar has like 9 levels for the novena. But a lot of people don't do that, like in their home that much anymore. But Los Planeros de la 21, they have been doing it. They put on a show for the Fiesta de Cruz, the May celebrations every year, and they've been doing it, I think, almost 27 years. So again, for people who may not know how to celebrate these things, you can find ways to do it with other groups. Should I take questions, or I don't know what we're running.
Do you want to wrap up maybe and take a few questions?
Okay, so I was going to go through the year. I only made it to May. I have a few other things to show you guys, but I'll stop there. And then if anyone has any questions about anything in particular, maybe.
As an Afro-Puerto Rican, I'm extremely glad that you were able to depict the presence of Afro-Puerto Rican during this journey, because there is a tendency to exclude their presence and contribution to the national experience. Así que te doy las gracias.
Well, thank you. And actually, the story about Rafael Hernandez is so. I think that the story is incredible. I mean, the 369 story is an incredible story, and then the added layer of how James V. Syrup went and learned about these musicians and the whole history of the bandas municipales there. And actually, if anyone's interested, there's going to be a big concert at Ostos on November 1st in honor of Rafael Hernandez's music, but also the 319th Army Band will open up, and they're going to do the music of the 369th. So, because I've been doing a lot of work with the regiment, the 369th Regiment, trying to help them archive some music and stuff, because they have displays there of the 369th in World War I, but they don't have anything about the Puerto Rican experience. But they realize that they don't have anything there, and they'd like to make sure they give recognition of that more. And that's just one. I mean, Rafael, that's just one story. Like I said, there's more. There's the Artur Schomburg. There's more stories of that. So, there's one there.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question about the impact of music in the community, and it deals with West Side Story. When West Side Story first came out, what do you think what was the impact of West Side Story and its portrayal of Puerto Rican in the Puerto Rican community?
I think I think there's a divided thing about it, right? There were these stories, and I mean, you can actually, if you interview a lot of people from that era, there were a lot of clashes between Italian gangs and Puerto Rican gangs. That was a fact of life. I mean, a lot of young men who grew up have these stories of that happening and that occurring. But there's also, at that time, at that era, there was this like fear. There was a lot of Puerto Ricans moving into New York, so there was just a growing fear of the menace, like the Puerto Rican menace. So that sort of like added to that. And I think the Cape Man happened around that time too, the story of the Cape Man. So it sort of like added to that. But then the funny thing is that actually the music they play is not even Puerto Rican music. And I think like actually America might be like I want to live in America. That's a Mexican tune, I think. Actually, it's a Mexican rhythm. So it's funny. So like they don't even portray what's really like Puerto Rican culture, but then everyone is so happy that Rita Moreno comes out of that and is and is nominated for all these things. So I think there's sort of like this love hate with it, and that's what I get out of it. I mean, there is, and then actually when I watch it sometimes now, I do feel like they did try to touch on some issues. Like you can look at it just surfacely and look at it like, oh, it's just horrible. It's really racist or something, but I think actually they do try to touch on like some of these issues. Like Rita Moreno's character talks to the cop, I think at one point, telling him he's racist. I think they do try to delve into issues, but it was just for that time what they were able to do. So I think there's pros and cons with it, I think, as well. I don't know if that's okay.
No, I was thinking of the values that they actually portrayed in that production.
Well, people have written about, like, actually the song that Rita Moreno sings, I Want to Be an American, is actually really bad. Like, she's putting down the island, like totally putting down everything about Puerto Rican culture, everything about the island, and just saying how everything's great in America. So you can look at that and say, well, that's actually, that's just sort of, it's all about you need to assimilate, everything, lose everything, and just be American, which was a product of like many of that generation. I know my father's generation probably went through and had to deal with, of something. So I've seen things written about that, that is problematic. That's definitely problematic in it. So.
Maybe one more question, then if people want to stay later and talk to you.
Okay, great. One more?
Just a quick question. Do you have a Facebook page or something like that where you have, people can look at things?
No, I anti-Facebook. I don't have Facebook. I'm like one of the last people probably on earth that doesn't have Facebook. But City Lore, I can give you the City Lore information. There's like stuff on City Lore, and there's some like we have some small like virtual exhibits about like the mambo to hip hop stuff and other things on there as well. Not this stuff so much, but some other stuff that I can give you that information for City Lore.
Museo del Barrio have a lot of video information too?
Museo del probably not. Just a really fast thing to kind of relevant to this is that a place like Clemente Soto Velas on the Lower East Side, they're an institution that kept their name. They made sure they kept the name Clemente Soto Velas because they were a Puerto Rican organization that was founded by Puerto Ricans. And obviously the community's changing. There's all kinds of Latinos moving in, but we were in the vanguard for a lot of things, and we need to remember that and give that recognition. So they're very adamant. The Nuyorican Poets Cafe, Miguel's not even on the board anymore. It's becoming not even anything about Nuyorican culture anymore. So the Clemente Soto Velas is the only place that holds it. Now El Museo has had a very difficult relationship with the community because they were founded by Puerto Ricans too. Again, at the same time, the Talla Boricua and all these things are founded. All these people are politically active. El Museo was founded at the same time by Puerto Ricans, but now they have a large Puerto Rican collection of like santos and different things, but you would never know if you walk in there that it was a Puerto Rican institution. The board is not Puerto Rican. Hardly anyone who works is Puerto Rican, and that's been a real butting heads thing with the community about that. So they did do the Nueva York exhibit, but that was because that was sponsored by the New York Historical Society. So that was these big institutions got together. But the El Museo, I don't know even know if they know about this. So
I just know of them before they were even the Museo del Barrio.
That's what it was amazing. It was founded by Mato Moreno Vega, the Caribbean Cultural Center, the poet Jack Agüeros, who did a lot on Julio Burgos. It was by all these people who were very active in the community, and artists themselves and cultural workers started that, and now it's sort of like lost all that, and then so it's been something that the community's been gone back and forth with them a lot about. So, but thank you everyone. I'm sorry I didn't get to show everything, but thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.